Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Money Matters podcast, the show where we discuss important financial topics that were never covered in med school. I'm your host, Dr. Tarang Patel. Before we get started on the podcast today, I want to thank you, the listener, for continuing to listen to this podcast. The numbers continue to grow significantly, and April was by far the best month that we've had in terms of downloads. So thank you. Thanks for sharing it with your colleagues, and thanks for joining the Facebook group. And I haven't mentioned this before, and some of you have already signed up, but if you could, please sign up for our email list. If you go to the drmoneymatters.com website, you can sign up for our email list, and you'll be the first to be notified of new podcast episodes prior to their release on Apple Podcasts. You'll have access to them a little bit earlier. So once again, thank you. The numbers, like I said, continue to grow. I also encourage you to join our Facebook group, Dr. Money Matters private Facebook group. I eventually plan on having some of our guests join us, and we're going to do live Facebook interviews. And you can, if you're a member of the group, you can actually ask questions in real time. And I think that'll be beneficial. So thank you for listening. Thanks for sharing. And we're going to talk a little bit about today's guest, Kayee Tong. He's a medical student in Texas who's very knowledgeable about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. And he wrote a post a few months back on passiveincomemd about paying for medical school and college with the profits that he made from cryptocurrencies. I've mentioned my thoughts on Bitcoin previously, but just let me reiterate that I don't feel like it's a good investment. It is a speculation, and plenty of people have made tons of money on it, and I'm not downplaying that. I just don't think by definition it's an investment. I have no idea, and neither do any of the investment professionals, what the value of any of these cryptocurrencies really are. It's currently about $9,000 last I checked on Coinbase a day or so ago. But it was near 20,000 in January of 2018 and down to about 6,500 just a few weeks ago. So do I regret not buying Bitcoin when I first heard about it in 2012? Absolutely. I think at that time it was under $60 a share or $60 a coin. But like I say, it's purely speculation, and that doesn't change whether the value is 100,000 or whether it's 50 cents. The mania from the holiday season has kind of dissipated a little bit, but that was the closest I've seen to the mania that was experienced back in the late 90s and 2000 about tech stocks. During the holiday season, the various social media finance groups, including mine, were littered with questions about people talking about buying and selling cryptocurrencies. The volume has now died down in terms of the questions and the trading, but some of those questions and about the infrastructure of Bitcoin still remain. So in this episode with Kayee, we talk about the basics of blockchain, how he started with Bitcoin, and about what he did in terms of starting a Bitcoin mining operation. And he also talks a little bit about a Bitcoin exchange that he ran. We talk a bit about the other flavor of coins, Ethereum, Litecoin. There's a few other coins out there. What his advice is on speculation with coins now, and what he's going to do with his different operations in the future. He also mentions a little bit about the security of the different coin exchanges. He's a busy guy as a medical student, doing the demands of medical school, plus learning and writing about cryptocurrencies, running these exchanges, and doing some mining. He also briefly mentions that he's involved in an investment fund, which he can't talk too much about, but it's amazing how busy this gentleman is. A couple of terms that he mentions are ICO, which is an initial coin offering, similar to an IPO, a stock initial public offering. And he also mentions an ASIC rig, which I actually had to look up. It's an application-specific integrated circuit. Basically, it's a dedicated computer designed just to mine cryptocurrencies. So he's definitely an entrepreneur. He once had a job offer from Google that he talks about, and it's just impressive to see how he's able to balance these various activities. And I expect we'll be hearing from him more in the future in terms of success stories about people knowledgeable about cryptocurrencies. I encourage you to check out his Quora page at cryptosignal.quora.com, in which he answers a lot of questions and also gives his thoughts and perspectives about cryptocurrency. So without further ado, Kayee Tong. Welcome to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. My guest today is Kayee Tong, a medical student at the University of Texas who was recently featured on the passiveincomemd site about paying off medical school with cryptocurrency. And so I wanted to kind of get a medical person involved in this podcast because I know a lot of people have been asking me about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and I am definitely no expert on it myself. I've been aware of it for a while, but I have not invested personally. So I kind of wanted to talk to someone like Kayee, who's actually been involved in it for a relatively long period of time, since 2012. First of all, welcome to the show, Kayee.
Thank you, Tarang, and thank you for having me as well.
All right, good. I'm glad to get you on the show. Your article was pretty interesting, and I wanted to kind of just talk to you a little bit about, first of all, you're a medical student, so tell me a little bit about your background and what got you into medicine.
Well, it's a very long story, but my dad was in medicine, and now he's more of a pharmaceutical consultant. And that kind of made me think about medicine at first. I did biochemistry back at UT Austin, and after I finished my MCAT, I actually had an interview offer at Google, and I thought about it pretty long and hard what I really wanted to do with my life, and I decided medical school was the thing I wanted to do. I'm thinking of neurology or psychiatry residency after that, and then go into the FDA through a fellowship. So I really want to get into clinical trials, and that's what really drawn me into medicine.
Okay, good. So that's interesting. So you had an offer from Google. That's something that, people, a lot of people, especially those in medical schools right now. There was a recent article talking about how a lot of people, particularly at the Bay Area medical schools, were actually not going into clinical medicine and leaving to join, these high-tech firms or startups. You just mentioned, you're thinking about doing neurology or psychiatry and then potentially getting into clinical trials, but that's more of the traditional path. It's kind of interesting that, you're going about it the way that I guess a lot of people would have back in the day. How does one turn down an offer from Google?
I thought about what I wanted to do, and a lot of the clinical trials globally are pretty exciting, and I really want to spend my time really wisely and do something I'll be excited to get up in the morning every day. So that's why I turned down the Google offer, even though the money's great and benefits are really good. I mean, I probably make more in Google than in medicine, frankly. But right. It definitely was a really long and hard choice. But I decided it was a pretty good one.
Okay, good. Well, I'm sure you'll be successful in whatever path you take. So let's talk a little bit about your background with cryptocurrencies. Mm-hmm. When did you get started, and kind of how have you been involved with that?
Well, I got started in 2012. I met a friend. He just came from San Francisco, and he sold his company for a few mil, and he wanted to get into something else besides websites. So we decided to do a mining rig at first. And then from there, we were looking at Bitcoin, and it was going pretty crazy. A lot of mania going on already. Mm-hmm. So we decided the easiest way to profit from this was to sell the pickaxes. So we started exchange at 2014, mm-hmm. When all the gold rush was still there. So that just making money off commission was what we originally intended to do. Mm-hmm. The SEC suddenly decided Bitcoin was money, so we needed a money transmission license in every state, and that kind of shut us down because it was very expensive to do. Mm-hmm. But I've always been still in Bitcoin for a while, just mining and also finding any investors that want to look into it. But I can't really advertise that on the podcast. So
right. Okay, so so back in 2012 and then 2014, you mentioned the pickaxe kind of thing. That's the reference to back in the San Francisco, California gold rush back in the 1850s, where people who were actually mining for gold may or may not have money, but the people who sold them the materials to do that always ended up being successful. So that's a pretty smart way of kind of getting into it. But so what in 2000? So you were mining. How did you set up the infrastructure for that?
Well, we already had a few computers already, and then back then we had a few GPUs, and also at the time there was at 2014 there started to get more ASIC miners. So we bought some of those. There was a lot of different options, and we're pretty skeptical about some of the warranties out there because it's a new field, and you have to be really careful about a few things. There's a few companies that got bankrupt because they couldn't keep their promise. But that's how we got started on the mining aspect of it. Okay.
And are you still doing that part?
Yes, I am. It's actually, we do have some accredited investors and we're doing solar powered mining.
Okay. So, because that's interesting because, even back in, I think 2013, 14, they were saying electric costs and mining for the average person was relatively cost prohibitive, and it's only gotten more difficult. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yes, it definitely is. Most of it is in China right now through hydroelectric plants. But there are some in the U.S., such as Washington State, where they have hydroelectric at less than 3 cents per kilowatt hour. Okay. And there's also solar that has some subsidies. So it's definitely possible. I wouldn't say it's necessarily feasible for everyone, but it can work for some people. And especially if you keep your hardware costs really low, then it's possible to profit from it. But you have to do a lot of research to do that, to figure out if it's suitable.
So for the average person who's, relatively recent to this Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency, mining is probably not the way to go. And more of them are probably just kind of involved in some of these exchanges. Would you agree with that?
I mean, it really depends. So I have a friend, he's in the dorms and they include electricity. Okay. So he's actually mining right now and he's making about maybe 7,000 projected per year. So that's not too bad.
No.
Yeah, not at all. It can pay for quite a bit, especially rents at least. Right. And there's some options out there too. It really depends. If you have access to, let's say, wholesale electricity prices, you might be able to do it. But I'd say for the general population, if they pay their electric bills, it probably isn't a good idea unless it's maybe if they use it as a heater. Right. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's you just have to do a lot of math on whether it's going to be profitable or not. And you have to really do your research as any investments.
Right. And is that true for just Bitcoin, or because there's all kinds of other coins that people are mining for? Or would you say that's pretty much true across the board nowadays?
I mean, it varies so much because the price of those coins are fluctuating at very, very high volatility. There are some algorithms that allow you to move between one coin and another, whichever is the most profitable. Although it's going to be a little bit harder if you're just getting into it. It requires a lot of technical expertise. So if you do have a partner that you can trust, then maybe that might be a route.
Okay. So let's go to these different coins. Obviously, Bitcoin is the most famous one. It's been around the longest. There's Ethereum, Litecoin. People have been talking about Ripple, but there's really essentially an unlimited amount of coins. Where do you think we're going to be with these coins in 5 years, which is an eternity in Bitcoin time?
Yes, it is. So there's right now probably around 1,500 that are listed. So those coins, there's so many coins out there. I don't even know all of them, frankly. And the thing is, a lot of them are very, very thinly traded. So those coins aren't going to be traded much at all. So we can, if they don't get popular, then there's no reason for it to be traded in the first place. Right. So there's a lot of marketing expenses they incur to try to get listed on exchanges and whatnot. And I won't bore you with the details, but there's a reason why you only hear about quite a handful of coins instead of all all the other ones. And it seems like there's an unlimited supply, but most of the developers and community is centered on a few coins. So there are some up and coming ones, but it's very speculative. So I wouldn't recommend getting into it unless you really understand or you have some sort of information that would allow you to have some predictive value.
Right, right. And I think that's just good advice in general with investing in general, whether it's cryptocurrency or whether it's, stocks or any other asset class. Now, as we speak, in the last day or two, there's been a pretty significant drop in the price of Bitcoin. But that's happened, so many times over the last, 5 to 6 years. So I think the people who've been in cryptocurrencies for a while are used to that, but probably the people who have, found out about it recently may be suffering a little bit. But what would your advice be to those who have kind of got into it recently? Would you just, tell them this is part of the game or part of the field that they're investing in?
Well, if history is any indicator, it's actually has been reported in the news every January. Bitcoin's RIP or it's crashing. So, I mean, the thing is, you have to really consider how much percentage of your portfolio is in Bitcoin if you are investing in it. And most of the time, that shouldn't be more than 10%. And you should be holding very long periods of time if you're considering any type of long-term investment outlook. So it's really hard to say if this is really it's for certain, but I mean, it's at least historically speaking that it's always recovered. But right. Like I said, it's really hard to predict. So I wouldn't go take a mortgage out or anything like that. That's probably not the best idea.
Right. Well, okay. So, but that being said, we see a lot of now proposed ETFs and these commodity exchanges. I think Chicago Mercantile Exchange was doing something. Do you think that legitimizes Bitcoin more? Or not Bitcoin, but cryptocurrencies in general?
I'd say it says a lot about the infrastructure on Bitcoin because you don't see Litecoin futures or Ripple futures or Ethereum futures. It's because the Bitcoin has quite a bit of liquidity and market cap. Mm-hmm. So it does, in a way, legitimize Bitcoin to some extent. And although the SEC is still kind of conservative on Bitcoin ETFs at the moment, but there's a lot of applications out, definitely. So yeah, it does legitimize it to a certain extent. It varies so much globally, and we really should look globally because the amount traded in the US is about, it's less than half. It's probably around 30% right now. Okay. And so speaking of kind of globally, I think China didn't they come out with some regulations or banning Bitcoin? And then there's some talk about, I think recently, and I'm not sure the details, but South Korea had some sort of regulation. How do you think that affects Bitcoin or cryptos in general? Well, for one, actually, China does allow individual ownership of Bitcoin, but they banned Chinese exchanges. They're trying to ramp up on Chinese miners. Mm-hmm. So they just don't want to get their citizens involved in speculation. And I think that's the main key here. But they don't, and they don't want any banks to get involved in it either. As far as South Korea is concerned, they're kind of split themselves, politically speaking. Some people want to ban it, and some people there's quite a big petition going on to not to appeal that process, and so it's really hard to say, regulatory speaking. And I'm not an expert in the regulatory matters. There is another place in China, in Hong Kong, that they have different laws, and they're very open about it, about letting people use Bitcoin and exchange there. So there's a lot of mainland Chinese that come down to Hong Kong to trade, and it's fully legal for them to do it. So it's really hard to say. There's so many outlets for them to do it. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the end of the world because Japan is very, very friendly with Bitcoin. So it's really hard to say. I wouldn't speculate too much on the regulatory aspects because it could go either way.
Sure. Okay. And I think that's a good point. Japan is actually very pro technology, pro cryptocurrency. So pro meaning that they've not been regulating it, and so I think like you said, we're basically kind of at this interesting time where the future is unclear. But I do think that regardless of what happens with Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of these other more mainstream currencies, I do think that the underlying technology, the blockchain, is going to be involved in and this is just me saying it, but it's pretty likely that some flavor of this is going to be used in currency in the future, whether it's a government-backed currency or whether it's a currency such as Bitcoin. If someone wanted to, first of all, can you explain kind of what blockchain is?
Oh, yeah. So blockchain is basically a public record of every single transaction that's been made on the network. The easiest way to say it is, let's say if I wanted to send you one Bitcoin, there's a lot of third parties that verify that this transaction happened and I didn't send the same Bitcoin to someone else. Mm-hmm. So that's the easiest way I can say it.
Okay. And it's hard to, virtually impossible to manipulate that ledger.
It's very, very costly, and it's usually very, very cost prohibitive to do so. Mm-hmm. You'd need a lot of computing power, more than like 51% is the amount, and that's a lot globally speaking. So far, it's been pretty robust for quite a while, since 2009. So, I mean, it's hadn't had any problems so far, so it probably won't. Because there's a lot of money involved. If someone could hack the network, there's billions of dollars for the first hacker that can do that for 9 years. I think that's saying that quite a bit.
Right. And it would have probably been done earlier in the evolution of Bitcoin, just because there was less of it out there and it was less mainstream. As more and more people are involved with it, it becomes exponentially harder to do. So, okay. So blockchain, I mean, a lot of companies are talking about it. And there are some companies that are talking about using it in medicine, using it in logistics. Do you have any thoughts about if someone wanted to invest in blockchain, which is which is an open source, software code, but not necessarily get into cryptocurrencies? And again, this is not investment advice. So that caveat, but what would your thoughts be? How would someone do that?
It's a really case by case basis. There are some talks about in the SEC for registering ICOs. So if you do have a registered ICO, it could work, but it's very, very, very risky, very speculative. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to say right now. The SEC has a quite strong stance on unregistered securities, but not all cryptocurrencies are necessary securities. So you'd have to do a lot of due diligence just for the average person. But if you're in the industry and you understand it pretty well, it could be a good bet, depending on the circumstance. If you're going for investing in a coin, as far as companies are concerned, there's quite a few blockchain technology companies out there. Google and Goldman Sachs both actively invest in a lot of them, and they're one of the biggest investors in that space. So it takes a lot of due diligence to look through a company's papers.
Right.
Also, you don't know for sure if it's going to turn out well or not, but it can turn out well. And historically, there are some billion-dollar companies that have come out, but it's really hard to choose unless you know what you're doing.
Right. Okay. So a little bit. So, the article that I referenced earlier on passiveincomemd talked about, you paying off med school with profits from cryptocurrency. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Could you tell me more about what type of aspects you
so basically, how did you? I mean, I guess. It's the article was suggesting that because you've been in it long enough, you had the profits and you were able to pay off your med school tuition. Whether you actually did or not is different. But how were you able to? I guess how did that happen? I mean, that's kind of what you were in it early enough, so I guess that's a positive thing. But just kind of go through your process of how you did that.
Well, I approached this on more of a framework of investments. And this is my logic. I decided that Bitcoin is more of a replacement for the gold markets. And even if it went up to 10% of the market cap of gold, that would mean quite a bit of return. Mm-hmm. So I put my portfolio no more than 10% in Bitcoin early on. And I did get a lot of mining in. I did have a hedge using futures. So I shorted Bitcoin partially just to make sure my exposure was the same. So I've always been exposed to that market for mm-hmm. quite a while. And mining has been very profitable. The exchange was actually really profitable. I was making actually near $1,000 a day for a few months. So, but that was split between the two co-founders. So mm-hmm. it also, but it already paid quite a bit for college itself and a little bit of medical school. And now just the mining itself has been paying off for quite a while. I mean, that's pretty much it. I do also have real estate. So that helps with cost of living as well.
So so you've kind of branched out into other things. But let me get back into a little bit of. So you yourself were not buying Bitcoins, is that correct?
I did buy a substantial amounts, but not more than 10% of my net worth.
Okay, and that was earlier on, not like recently, obviously.
Yes.
Okay. So and then you were getting more with the mining and then running, and then you were obviously making some money with running that exchange as well, like you said. So if you could give some advice to your med school colleagues, around the country, around the world, really, about investing and stuff, what would you tell them?
I'd say that you'd have to kind of look at your individual situation, especially globally speaking. There are some arbitrage opportunities. So there's different prices in different countries. Mm-hmm. So that might be one way to do it. I do know a few people that went to South Korea recently, and mm-hmm. they bought some Bitcoin here in the US and then sold it over there in South Korea, and they made I think it was about $2,000 per Bitcoin. So it's definitely possible to profit from it if you're really careful about the risks involved. Right. For just an average person which doesn't have too much knowledge, but they know enough to invest, and they know they're not going to lose their shirt either. So,
right.
There's that. There's mining that might work. There's also some people that do margin lending. So some people that take out margin loans would essentially borrow from these investors, and the rewards have gone down, mm-hmm. but at some point it was about 1% per day, and now it's like 0.02% or something like that per day. So I mean, it was pretty good at some point, and there's some exchanges that do still allow margin lending, so that could possibly work in the future as well.
Okay. And then you had mentioned, you had hedges against, Bitcoin, mm-hmm. and you were shorting Bitcoin. How are you doing that? Is that because as far as I know, most mainstream, mm-hmm. do the exchanges allow that, or you were just you had found some other instruments to do that?
Oh, there were some Chinese exchanges that allowed futures contracts before the CME, the CBOE got their futures contracts. Okay. So it was possible to short them at a time before they even had those contracts out in the US.
Okay. And I mean, boy, that's you're a gutsy guy. So shorting cryptocurrency, that's very gutsy. But it's also probably a smart way if you're exposed more so to the upside with your overall portfolio. It's a good way to hedge. So now you do run an investment fund called Bitcoin.
Yes, I do run an investment fund. It's called Bitcoin's Capital LP, but I can't really talk too much about it because it's a private placement. I can't advertise with general solicitation. So
Gotcha.
I would rather not.
I'm not going to ask you details about that. I'm just more interested. How do you have the time to balance all these things with medical school?
Oh, that's a really good question. And for me, it's basically I've had a lot of help. I do have one virtual assistant. I used to have a personal assistant, but not anymore. And my fiance is really supportive. So I've had quite a bit of help regarding time-wise, and I really owe a lot to her.
Good. Oh, that's a good good shout out. Always give credit to the people that help you out, particularly a fiance or a wife or parents. Well, I think we're going to wrap up a little bit here. Tell Kayee, tell our listeners where if they wanted to find out more about your about you and what you write about. I think you have a page on Quora, right?
Yes, I do. I have a page on Quora where I write about a lot of cryptocurrency investment frameworks and just overall markets in general. It's just opinions, and I feel like a lot of people can benefit from just learning different investment frameworks and the business mindset in general. And I feel like a lot of physicians don't necessarily learn these principles really early on.
Right.
And that could be a problem in the future because we're moving towards value-based reimbursements, and it's getting more. There's more business principles involved these days. So I would definitely look into that type of stuff. And if you're interested, definitely follow my Quora.
Okay, I'll put a link on the show notes to do that. Last thing, I think I just didn't quite get into this, but I wanted to ask you. There was some talk about like the hacking of the exchanges. There was a famous one a few years ago, the Mt. Gox, and then Coinbase recently had a little bit. Do you think that these exchanges are safe?
No exchange is 100% safe. I'd say Coinbase has pretty good security so far. Mm-hmm. And a lot of, and this is just from someone that's operated exchange before. There's a lot of security protocols that are needed, but not necessarily every exchange would follow those type of security protocols. Mm-hmm. So you really have to pick and choose. There are some custodians out there that also are another option, or you could use hardware wallets, but that's a little bit more technical. And I would recommend just reading a book about it first from a reputable author. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any recommendation?
Oh, yeah. My recommendation would be Mastering Bitcoin by Andreas Antonopoulos.
Okay. And I'll put a link also for that one on the show notes. Okay. Well, great. Thank you. This was very informative. A lot of technical stuff, but I think useful information for those who, have been hearing about Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and are interested in, learning more. And I'm not advocating anyone go out and invest by buying Bitcoin right now, but I do think that understanding some of the technology is going to be critical to future transactions and probably in other fields that we're not even thinking of right now, because I do think the blockchain is going to be important in a lot of in healthcare in general. So, Kayee, thank you. Okay, thanks for listening to this episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. I want to thank Kayee Tong for being my guest today. He taught me a lot about cryptocurrencies that I actually didn't really understand previously, and I hope you learned something as well. The book that he recommended, Mastering Bitcoin, I'll put a link up on the show notes as well as his Quora page. And I also have a link of the article that he wrote on passiveincomemd.com. I want to thank you for listening to this podcast and continuing to support it. More episodes are available at drmoneymatters.com or on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, etc. And I encourage you to, again, join our Dr. Money Matters Facebook group, and you can follow me on Twitter at drmoneymatters. And I also have a link to Kayee's Twitter profile on the show notes. Once again, I just want to reiterate how impressed I was talking to Kayee, and I suspect that anyone who can balance the amount of different activities that he has going on in addition to med school, it bodes well for the future of the medical profession, that we have intelligent people like him and staying in our field rather than choosing to go work exclusively with high tech or finance. So it's a positive sign for medicine in the future. Once again, if you could just leave us a positive review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. Predominantly, the more reviews that we get, the more positive reviews we get, the better the show ranks. And in the last few weeks, I really have increased the number of positive reviews that we've had. And so I want to thank the members of the Dr. Money Matters group, as well as the Doctors on Social Media group on Facebook. And if you're interested in, if you're a physician interested in expanding or developing your social media presence, I encourage you to join that group as well. And also, as usual, I recommend you support our other physician colleagues who host podcasts as well, such as Docs Outside the Box, The Hippocratic Hustle, The Happy Doc, Doctors Unbound, and Physician Road, the Physician's Road, amongst many other podcasts out there. So please support your physician colleagues. Another episode of Dr. Money Matters will be coming soon. Thanks for listening.